will have an awesome panel discussion moderated by senior producer and presenter Rachel Kelly.
You're listening to Money FM 89.3, Singapore's most influential radio station. I'm Rachel Kelly, and now we'll be broadcasting a live AIBotics 2020 Go Digital series, a panel discussion on understanding the importance of ethical and responsible AI. Now, throughout today's webinar session at the AIBotics Go Digital series on ethical and responsible AI, esteemed panelists and speakers have provided an overview of ethical issues in AI, intelligent robotics, the role of ethical intelligence, and the real world, as well as ethical considerations for investing in AI technology. Now it's time for us to discuss the key considerations in creating an ethical and responsible culture for building intelligent solutions. And to do so, we're joined today by esteemed panelists. We have our keynote speaker from today's session, Professor Alessandro Vinciarelli, and he's a professor of computational social intelligence at Glasgow University. Mr. Jason Tamara Wijaya, and he's co-founder of Loretta. Mr. Teng Chuang Kiang, and he's the managing director of Interactive. Ms. Olivia Gamblin, Ethical Intelligence Scotland. Mr. Amrit Anshu Roy, and he's the COO of Greenfield Advisory. And Dr. David Bodoff, and he's a senior lecturer at the University of Haifa, as well as head of research at Core AI Consulting. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Great. Well, to start this session and to lay the foundation for today's discussion, perhaps we can start off, and I'd like to ask you all, if you had to come up with one headline for the key issue of AI and ethics for 2020, what would it be? Professor Alessandro, let's start with you. What's your headline for this year? Perhaps Chuan, perhaps you can share with us instead.
Autonomy. Autonomy leads us to the need for ethics. If there's no ethics, then autonomy will misbehave as defined by the machine, and therefore, without ethics, it's going to create chaos.
Autonomy. And Olivia, what's your headline story for AI and ethics?
I would say accountability. As we look to implement ethics into our day-to-day technological development cycles, accountability and being able to be brave enough to stand up and say, okay, I'm going to take responsibility for these decisions that I'm making, and I'm going to take responsibility for the consequences of the technology. And Jason, from you?
I think I'll go with bridging philosophy and practice because there's been a lot more attention to the subject lately, but I think there's still a gap in terms of what we are talking about and what we are doing in the day-to-day.
And Amrit Anshu, from an investor's perspective, what's your headline for AI this year?
Responsibility.
Responsibility for investing in AI?
Yeah, and to make sure that how it can address such further things, whatever has happened in 2020.
And Dr. David and Professor Alessandro, tell us, what are your headlines for the year?
Mine would be on.
Well, I think that.
Go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, it is about people as much as it is about machines. We cannot address the problem only from a technological point of view. It is also about us as humans.
And I'm going to go with, we have to wake up, folks. This stuff is here now, yesterday even. It's everywhere. It's time to deal with this.
And speaking on the back of that, Dr. David, at the risk of really oversimplifying it, essentially when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about the study of right versus wrong, right? Regardless of whether we're talking about AI or we're talking about humans, because as humans, we have an ingrained ethical and moral compass, or at least we're supposed to. But from an intelligent solutions perspective, how do we really start to chart these waters? And Olivia, you've got an interesting job title. You're actually an AI ethicist. Is that correct? So maybe you can tell us from your perspective, how do you even start to navigate this?
Yes, that's right. I am an AI ethicist, philosopher by trade, as I like to say, from my background. But when it comes to navigating ethics and the implementation of it, it's very important to understand that context is actually very important to ethics. We are taking what can be considered a very gray field and looking to apply it to a very black and white field. So being able to take these high-level principles and understandings that, yes, are innate in our humanity, and looking at how to specifically apply them to concrete situations. So that ability to move from the abstract level down to the concrete situations is really what we are trying to understand how to do with this application of ethics in our technology.
So let's just paint a picture here so that we can better understand exactly what we're trying to articulate. Because I think, Chuan, as you mentioned during your presentation and during a paper that you've written, say that we have driverless vehicles here in Singapore. I believe there's been a study that says that Singapore is a perfect roadmap to implement driverless vehicles, given the size of the roads here, the population size. So we have a driverless vehicle driving down the road in Singapore. A pedestrian falls on the road in front of the car. How does the vehicle know, with the AI behind the vehicle and the tech, whether to save the driver or the pedestrian? Is that what we're talking about when it comes to AI and ethics?
Yes, there's a classic philosophical question in ethics. Do you pull the trigger? Do you kill one guy, or do you kill the 5 guys if you do not act? So if the question is a dilemma like this, then the question is moral values, right? I mean, if it is out of your control, you're ethically not wrong to hit the pedestrian. It's the pedestrian's fault. But if you love your neighbor, then you sacrifice your life. So therefore, you don't have a conflict with yourself as far as upholding that ethical value is concerned. Now, I actually wrote this and said, how about a ethical configuration option for the driver to say, do I sacrifice myself in a situation like this, or do I sacrifice the other party? Of course, if Mercedes-Benz were to have this option, then if you configure it this way, you are revealing your intention, aren't you? So it's going to be quite tricky to implement these kind of ethical values. But it is doable. Technologically, almost anything is possible, right? The question is whether the human imagination wants to take it, and under what value and context you want to take it.
And I assume from that perspective as well, we're really kind of integrating elements of machine learning, perhaps machine bias, or understanding and evaluating a situation depending on the technology that's put into a certain type of, whether it's a driverless vehicle or something else, or if we're looking at robotic assistance. Now, Professor Alessandro, I wanted to bring you in here because watching some of the talks that you have online, you talk a lot about the communication between AI and humans, and you made some very interesting points during your discussion earlier, and you work to help machines understand social landscapes and particular situations, in a sense, as humans do. And you made a very important, or I thought it was very interesting point during your presentation earlier, and you spoke about the way that we react to machines. In that car situation, we're talking about how a car would react to 2 different situations, but from an ethical perspective as well, how we as people communicate with the machines that we have on a daily basis, whether it's our Google Home or our Siri. So this is really changing the landscape, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, we have evidence that the very presence of artificial intelligence changed the way we behave and changed our way we deal with ethical issues. So, for example, there are experiments that show that depending on whether there is a robot or not in a room, even a robot that simply does not, and it is simply there present, people can behave more or less prosocially simply because they feel the surveillance, they feel the presence of someone that they perceive as human. So from this point of view, there is an impact on our own ethical behavior from the very simple presence of the machines. Even if these machines do nothing, they are just perceived as intelligent agents, and as such, they influence us.
So how is that really changing the interaction that we're seeing between people and machines and then artificial intelligence, and how does ethics tie in there?
Well, it ties in the sense that whenever we design this type, we still don't know very well how this influence takes place. And so at the moment we design, we can have effects that we do not think are there. So from this point of view, there are sometimes positive effects. For example, we help to raise more funds for a particular cause, that was to help children to get proper surgery in poor country by simply playing with these effects. But at the same time, we were wondering whether this is really ethical, in the sense that we did it exploiting this natural effect we have to behave better when we feel that there is an intelligence presence with us. So from this point of view, it is at the same time the influence that machines have on our ethical behavior and our possibility to exploit this effect, that even if we do it with a good intention, for the very simple fact that we do it exploiting effects of which people are unaware, poses very serious questions about whether it is a good thing to do or not. So it is a very complex issue, actually, and there is no easy solution to it.
And speaking about whether we have technology around us and the way that we interact, because let's talk about privacy, let's talk about transparency, and let's talk about accountability, because these are all principles that are really tied to ethics, ethical AI, and perhaps we can discuss these in the context of what's happening in the world at the moment when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't think we can really have this conversation without bringing this up at some point or another. And Olivia, you recently published an article titled "We Need Ethics to Teach in Tech Now More Than Ever" as a result of COVID-19. And this really explored the debate behind privacy for tracing apps. We have a tracing token that's been launched here in Singapore, but we've all been using Trace Together, the app here as well. So let's talk about the importance of trust in AI. Why is it so critical now more than ever in light of everything that's happening?
Well, COVID has actually provided us with a great, let's call it philosophical case study that we can actually see the direct effects of what happens when a community, when the public does not trust a piece of technology. So I'm speaking also specifically from the UK, where there was a contact tracing app that was issued and no one adopted it. And what I like to point out here is when talking with people, I would ask them, why didn't you download your contact tracing app? And it was always, well, I don't trust it. I don't know where my data is going. I don't know what data is being collected on me. There's no transparency. I also feel like it's an invasion of my privacy because, again, I don't know what data is being collected on me. I don't know what kind of control I have over my data. I don't know I don't know who's looking into really a very personal aspect of my life, and who is accountable at the end of the day if I get a false positive issued and suddenly I have to shelter in place because my contact tracing app told me, and yet that causes me to miss out on work or lose income. Who's accountable for that on the other end? So all of these principles are called into question specifically with these contact tracing apps. And what this highlights is the fact that when the public, when your targeted user base does not trust an application, they're not going to use it. And in order to establish trust in your technology, in your applications, you actually need to pay very close attention to these ethical questions, these principles, these dilemmas. And so it's done I'll say a beautiful job of highlighting a very complex issue.
Jason, what are your thoughts on this? Because I know that you briefly mentioned this during your presentation as well in terms of trust in AI.
I think trust in AI is a very complex topic. I mean, you might need to unpack it a little bit. Certainly, privacy is one aspect of it. And it's something that is inherently requires lots of players coming together. So to tackle the privacy one, for instance, you want to have something, maybe some policy level stuff, some company level things, and some technical level implementations. So it probably needs lots of players coming together to address broad concepts like trust.
And David, I know when we met virtually before the conference took place, we spoke about, some of the opportunities when it comes to implementing AI, and especially when it comes to these tracing apps that we're seeing being rolled out across the globe. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, in terms of opportunities, I think I like that in today's session altogether, there was a good emphasis on opportunities. Normally, ethics and AI, we conjure it as a threat. AI is a threat, and how are we going to defend against ethical offenses? But I think on a lot of the talks we saw today, there's opportunities here everywhere. Just the fact that we're having this webinar. I mean, we're also talking along the way about human ethics. We're sharpening our understanding of right and wrong along the way. Well, why are we having this webinar? It's because machines are here to be constructed by us. We have sort of carte blanche, a blank slate, and we're putting our minds to it as a society. So this itself, in the macro level, otherwise we would normally just leave ethics to the ethicists. I would never be involved in an ethics discussion. So there's a buzz around it, and it's an opportunity to reflect on human ethics while we're discussing machine ethics. And the professor also, I think, made a few very deep points, but to think that we're sharpening our appreciation of what's special about humans, and what is allowing us to do that is the fact that we have AI encroaching and forcing us to define what's really human about us. This is beautiful stuff. So at the macro level, there are beautiful opportunities here.
So why do you think we're seeing such a direct shift at the moment towards a greater understanding, a greater appreciation of ethics when it comes not just to AI, but who we are in the relationship as it ties together?
I think it probably does begin with the bad stuff, with the fear, because it's a machine. And we've gotten lucky, though, that the conversation has not remained there, the scary machine and how we're going to defend against the machine. That's removed 20 years ago. And so I think it probably is the fact that it's ubiquitous. And I was saying in my talk before, those of us who are in this webinar, we know that machine learning and AI is everywhere. Folks, we really don't know how everywhere it is. It is everywhere. It is more everywhere than you even think. And so that was probably the trigger. But it's been a blessing, I think, in disguise. Yeah.
And Professor Alessandro, from the presentation that you gave earlier, obviously this conversation has been evolving not just in terms of what's happening on a day-to-day basis, but we're seeing more literature come out on this, and you referenced a number of pieces in your presentation as well. So why do you think we're seeing such a pivotal shift now? So you're listening to Money FM 89.3, Singapore's most influential radio station, and you're listening to a forum discussion as part of AIBotics Go Digital series on ethical and responsible AI, and we're discussing the key considerations to creating an ethical and responsible culture for building intelligent solutions. And Professor Alessandro Vincerelli, please share with us, so why do you think we're seeing such a shift when it comes to humans and AI and ethics at the moment in terms of this wider conversation that we're seeing at the moment?
Well, because there have been a few technological steps in the last few years, in particular, the advent of deep networks, these very strong technologies that have helped technology to make a major steps in terms of effectiveness. At this point, in the last few years, a few things that were considered science fiction, like speech recognition, which very high effectiveness, ability to transcribe, possibility to track facial expressions, possibility to track the gesture that people do, have become so effective that many science fiction applications became possible. At this point, these technologies have entered human life, have started to show their effects, and inevitably it has become an important issue. Let's think, for example, of the advent of personal assistants like Siri, Alexa, etc. People are using them every day. They are more and more effective. They allow people to interact in a very natural way with technology. At the same time, they've opened the possibility for these machines to know about people much more than how people think they are releasing to the technology. And of course, this has determined enormous question.
So I have to ask then, on the back of that, I mean, Olivia brought up this point earlier and she talked about ethics washing. Amrit Anshu, what are your thoughts on that when it comes to looking at AI from an investment perspective? If you're looking at it from a VC perspective, what are some of the key issues that you look out here? Because, you know, let's not forget, a few years ago, we did see Volkswagen. It took I think it was a £30 billion blow in fines for unethical programming software. I mean, that's a big name. And we know that investor appetites are changing. As you mentioned during your presentation, they're really looking beyond the bottom line to issues such as ESG, transparency, and ethical risk. So to what extent is this ethics washing an issue, and how are companies addressing it? Sorry, Amrit, I think you'll need to remove the mute from your microphone.
Yeah, okay,
Olivia,
I'm so sorry.
there we go.
Yeah, so whether be it in terms of like, a bigger company like Volkswagen or, even bigger startups like, we have in Silicon Valley, the investors are striving to, and as well as the companies, they are striving to make a difference, by resisting the urge to push, to growth and profit above everything, right? And it is important more so given the way, AI is coming to change the basics of the business, right? And with these growing concerns, the ethical implications and often the biased tendencies of artificial intelligence, these investing firms and technological accelerator programs, they are all increasingly requiring the startup firms to develop guidelines, and that's how investor community as well as the companies are looking changing the guidelines now and offering ethics.
And Jason, you're involved in a startup. Can you share with us your thoughts on ethics washing and what you've seen in the market?
Yeah, I think from the startup perspective, we are constantly in a existential mode. So it is not easy to take on something just because it is popular in the market, and it takes a lot of courage to do something right, because you're working on limited resources and limited runways, and to embed these things in technology is not easy. But I do hope we see more companies like competing on ethics in the near future.
We've got a question that's just come in from the audience, and they've asked, how can government play a part to help citizens understand the AI and ethics so that they can leverage and benefit from technology? Perhaps, Olivia, would you like to take this question first?
Yeah, sure, Rachel. One of the ways that the government actually can help is providing programs for technical literacy in the first place. A lot of the struggles of the general public is actually being unaware, as David was saying, unaware of just the extent to which we interact with AI and machine learning algorithms on a day-to-day basis. By instilling this technical literacy, so an understanding of how these algorithms, how these systems are working with us, and how we interact with them, it actually educates the general public to have a better understanding, a better agency over their own data and autonomy over their own being in this digital world. And then, of course, from there, providing these ethical guidelines and policies so that you have the hierarching ethical principles that we are looking to follow. That instills confidence into technology and companies as well. If the general public sees, okay, they're following these guidelines, we at least have a baseline of an understanding of what factors are being considered. But first and foremost, people need to be able to understand the technology.
Chuan, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, because I know you mentioned this briefly during your presentation as well.
Yes, I let me extrapolate all the way. It means voting counts. Be careful who you vote into power. They have the data, and data is power. So we want to really look into this very carefully, how data is used. Nobody should be above the law, and these things is going to be brought to bear to light, how we look at these important principles. So yeah, we have to make sure that the authorities are not above the law.
And David, what are your thoughts on this? I see you nodding and agreeing there.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. The question made me think. I'm in an area where I'm an academic. We're always hungry for funding. There's lots of government funding for anything related to AI and machine learning. I don't recall there being much funding for anything related to ethics in. Rather, those efforts, initiatives that I'm familiar with are all bottom up. They're all coming from real people with various societal concerns. So it's food for thought, that question. So I agree with what Olivia mentioned, that to the extent that society, normal citizens, would be aware of the technology, I'll bet that's where we would find percolating more concern and attention. So government certainly has a role, but I haven't seen them playing it. I'm going to trust the people more than the government on this point.
Professor Alessandro, you're agreeing there as well as our other academic on the panel. What would you like to add?
Yes, I think the very good point was made by each one. Data is power, and nowadays these technologies can capture an unprecedented clear picture of reality. They can know about us more than ourselves know about ourselves. So from this point of view, this gives enormous amount of power. So from the point of view of the law, the best thing that law government can do is to keep up with technology that often evolves faster than legal and political adaptation to the situation, and ensure that there is transparency in the use of this power. Ensure that there is, for all of us, possibility to control the data we provide voluntarily and involuntarily, and ensure that actually there is no abuse of this enormous power that can be used for good, but can be used for bad too.
This is Money FM 89.3, Singapore's most influential radio station, and you're listening to a forum discussion as part of the AIBotics Go Digital series on ethical and responsible AI, and we're discussing key considerations to creating an ethical and responsible culture for building intelligent solutions. And we're joined on the panel by Professor Alessandro Vinciarelli, and he's Professor of Computational Social Intelligence at Glasgow University, Mr. Jason Tamarawijaya, co-founder of Loretta, Mr. Teng Chuan Hyang, Managing Director of Interactive, Ms. Olivia Gamblin, co-founder of Ethical Intelligence, Mr. Amrit Anshu Roy, COO of Greenfield Advisory, and Dr. David Bodoff, Senior Lecturer at the University of Haifa and Head of Research at Core AI Consulting. Now, a key issue that I have to ask all of you that's often raised when it comes to AI, robotics, and development in this field is man versus machine, and whether AI will replace humans in some areas of the working world. And, you know, this has been brought up in numerous industries, from automated audits to the rise of robo-reporters. But let's talk about the importance of the collaboration between the two, because we're looking at jobs creation, aren't we? And I think there was, according to the World Economic Forum, AI is actually expected to create nearly 58 million new jobs by 2022. So what might these new roles look like? Before we head further down that political landscape, let's talk about the workforce. Because, Olivia, you've created an interesting title for yourself. Well, not created an interesting title for yourself, but your designation is very interesting. You're an AI ethicist. So what other designations or new roles are we seeing that are going to be created in the landscape as a result of this collaboration between AI, man, and machine?
Well, my own role, as you said, it's a very interesting title that you don't see quite often. I am a part of a wider growing community, the AI ethics community. Within that field, we have AI ethicists, we have responsible technologists, we have responsible, trustworthy tech policymakers. There is a wide plethora of growing, developing titles in that direction. The main movement that we're seeing there, though, is people specializing in the ethical application of technology and how that looks. So that's going to be, from my personal standpoint, one of the very, very cool, new and developing job titles that are coming with this new era of tech.
And Amrit Anshu, from a business perspective as well, even if we're looking at audit, we're seeing this collaboration or consolidation between traditional audit and AI, and the two coming together. So new skill sets are being brought into the industry. But what else are you seeing from a finance perspective?
Yeah, I mean, from a finance perspective, we do a lot of trades, and algo trades are something which are now in, right? Apart from that, we are looking at automation of many activities within finance, whether be it regular bank reconciliation processes or in regular mundane processes where we had a lot of issues with human errors. And that has perfected us a lot. So AI has been a wonder, in finance industry per se.
And jobs and upskilling is really a huge topic at the moment as well, in light of everything that we're seeing happening with COVID-19 and the impact that it's having on the economy. So for people who may be interested in terms of how they can upskill or enter this particular arena, what are some of the the courses or the roles or avenues perhaps that they should look at? And Jason, you're nodding there. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that when people think about jobs in AI, they often kind of jump to, oh, I need to learn coding, I need to be a programmer. But as Olivia is such a good example, there is a wealth of jobs outside of just programming AI systems. I'm told that our team actually has one of the Olivia equivalents, one of the first ones in Singapore. So we also have an AI ethicist in Singapore. And it's a very interesting multidisciplinary role where you are trying to be technical enough to work with machine learning engineering teams, but also have that kind of almost a liberal arts as well as a business acumen as well as a legal/compliance angle to it. So I think it's one of those new multidisciplinary jobs. But beyond that, we can also think about what goes into the design of an AI system. So we are creating jobs such as AI product owners and managers. And lots of investment into user research in order to make those interactions work well. So not just programming, but many things beyond.
And Dr. David and Professor Alessandro, from the students that you work with and that you speak with and that you lecture, what are some of the newer, interesting areas that they're looking to move into? Perhaps Professor Alessandro, you can share with us.
Yes, one of the most interesting areas that are emerging now in the field of artificial intelligence is what is called at large emotion AI or social AI. This is a bit one of the latest frontiers that have to be explored, how somewhat machines can manage to make sense of our psychological conditions. So from this point of view, this is attracting more and more investment in industry. It is a growing area in industry. And from this point of view, more and more students are going towards that direction, which is innovative. It is interdisciplinary. It is something where not only people with mathematical, technological, computer science background, but also psychologists, neuroscientists, people with a much wider background can do. And from this point of view, it's also an ideal ground for having education that is not purely technological, not purely technical. I would say this is one of the most interesting areas students try to explore right now.
And David, from an AI and ethics perspective, perhaps?
Well, yeah, I'm sorry, I was trying hard all day to strike a positive note on every question you've raised. Look, there's no getting around the fact that there's severe job displacement. AI, there's going to be winners and losers. And with all respect to the interesting kinds of new jobs that people with certain privileges will be able to take upon themselves, there's going to be continuing hollowing out of middle-income professional type of jobs. There's winners and losers here, and there's no way around that. So there's an ethical implication of the whole existence of the industry. People will be displaced. People will be made redundant. That's just what happens with technology. There's winners and losers.
And so for those that want to find out more, I believe the next AIBotics 2020 webinar will have a digital workforce focus, and that'll be on the 15th of October. So for people who want to find out more, they can tune in then as well. So the next question, Dr. David, just following on from what you're talking about, let's talk about biases in AI, because we haven't really touched on that yet. And your presentation was titled Part of the Problem or Part of the Solution. And as you mentioned earlier, machine learning, it's widespread, it's impacting everything. It's a part of our lives at the moment. And you spoke about time travel and time machines. Tell us, what's happening?
Well, okay, I want to go back and be positive again. There's a lot of very, very sophisticated talent on these problems. And so the ethicists have now been joined by a lot of very fancy mathematicians to approach the issues of bias mathematically. So the ethicists are bringing thousands of years of understanding of how to approach ethical problems. The mathematicians bring us certain up-to-date computational rigor. Look, ethics is extremely rigorous. Philosophy, there's nothing more rigorous than ethics and philosophy, but it's not always computational. The pairing of the two is good news. I mean, you want to call it computational ethics. It sounds like the professor doesn't believe that that's possible. I actually believe it is. But the pairing of these two very smart computer scientists with very smart ethicists working on things like bias, real nuts and bolts stuff. Those problems are being solved. Those problems are being chipped away at. And along the way, there's an increased awareness. So I'm very happy about that teamwork. So bias specifically in machine learning, that's going to be handled. I'm convinced of that. That's going to go away, and that's a good thing. It's going to replace the loan officer. We're going to do better than the loan officer. We'll go figure what that loan officer was thinking. Here, I think there's good news because it's a very specific problem, and we're going to do better than imitate the biases of the traditional loan officer. Machine learning is shedding light on that, and without putting that loan officer in jail, we're just going to replace him with something better. So on that very narrow topic, I think machine learning and AI is good news. In the broader topic, the implications of AI is an open question.
So looking to the future, I just want to bring this back to business because in an article earlier this year, Chuan, you asked us to imagine storing all of your employees' knowledge as well as behavioral information of all of your customers and then apply the most advanced algorithms on top of what employees know and how customers behave to accomplish business goals that have been set out. Is this the future for corporates?
Well, I think it's a future for everyone. Right? Like what David said, AI is already here. I think we have to reinvent ourselves. And a constant question that I ask myself is how should I educate my kids? So that I have a 9-year-old and a 19-year-old and I'm telling them in a few years' time, AI is going to be mainstream and you need to learn how to work alongside the machine. And therefore, you need to learn how to think outside of the algorithm, not within the algorithm. The human mind is able to deal with infinity, but not the machine. The machine gets caught up in infinity. So the future is such that we have to reinvent ourselves. We have to learn new skills. We have to see what brings about a better way to change the world. And that begins in education all the way to the way we think, how we work with AI. And of course, at the end of the day, the word good in ethics has to be understood. And of course, for me, love your neighbor is probably one of the best ways to define what is good.
Amrit Anshu, what's your perspective here when it comes to the evolution of AI within business, not just those that are focused specifically on AI development, but when you're looking at it from an ethical perspective?
So, from a business perspective, what we have been looking at is most of the AI aspects that we have, they are much before the government and the society can catch up to, right? And as I told in my presentation that, most of these companies are in a realm where there's no regulatory environment right now which is available or which, kind of boundaries them on to what to do, what not to. And in that realm, AI, has to be, as somebody was writing in the chat, on the Hippocratic Oath, right? It has to be guided by the Hippocratic Oath, where, and ethics come, into play. That's my perspective on that.
And you gave the example, you mentioned briefly Theranos, which we've all read the news articles about. And on the flip side as well, we've seen the share price of a number or numerous tech firms outperform the market this year. From an investor perspective, they may look attractive, but what should they really be mindful of in this regard? How can they dig deep? Because, when it comes to a lot of these players, some of them are already tied to or they're tagged to, and they have relationships and partnerships with larger corporations that could be seen as, heavyweights and provide some strong backing towards, or credibility is the word that I'm looking for, towards that as a particular investment. So how can investors really deep dive and look at what are some of the things they should be mindful of, especially when it comes to investing in these companies, whether it's from an ethical perspective or from a broader perspective as well?
Yeah, I mean, market versus economy, I mean, that has been quite divergent in the last few months, right? When it comes to, whatever is happening at the, in the market is a buoyancy. A lot of other factors come into play, with regards to how is the liquidity and stuff like those. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to looking at their business practices, right, we have seen that many companies, including like the biggest of them, like Facebook's, have been questioned of late, right? And we keep kind of or whether be it Google, right? They have been challenged in EU on ethics related stuff. So we have to keep in mind as to how they are faring, and what's the public sentiment rather at large going for them or against them. And though, I mean, all of them are evolving as we go, as we said, that the regulatory environment as such doesn't exist for most of them, right? And if they are guided by some principles or not, is what will change the way these companies evolve in the coming future.
So I'm just going to, mindful of time, because we've got about 9 minutes left on the clock. Can you believe it? The time has flown by. There's just so much to cover, and it's so interesting. But we've got a few more questions coming from our listeners. And one of them is, what about the ethical treatment of AI engines that are authors of artwork, poetry, literary works? This is a really interesting question. They go on to add, do we extend the same ethical principles that we apply to human authors to them? For example, when it comes to compliance with authors' copyright. Perhaps, Professor Alessandro, would you like to start with a response for that question?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, because at the moment we have machines that are autonomous, meaning that there is not a human user behind. They act on their own, even if it is not like our human agency, but still they act on their own. It is very difficult to see to what extent they are responsible. And there is a very famous sentence that describes this type of situation. There is no soul to damn, and there is no ass to kick. So there is no way potentially to punish or to sanction a technology of this type. So it is a very difficult problem, and I think we are at the very beginning of that discussion. Probably what will happen is that the developer of those technologies will be considered responsible. At the moment, this seems to be the most common approach for this type of problem, but it's not optimal as an approach.
So I'm going to jump in with one last question as well here from the audience, and it's, what are 1 to 2 things citizens can do to trust and leverage technology to augment their capability? Jason, would you like to take this one?
That's an interesting question. I think 2 thoughts come to mind. Firstly, I think AI has hit the world a lot more quickly than many people have expected. So what was once something we thought was 10 or 20 years away is now something that we're living with side by side today. So I think many mechanisms of our society are trying to catch up in terms of regulation and understanding and so on. So I think the first thing would be to educate ourselves, to understand a bit more. And there are initiatives, including here in Singapore, to learn about topics like AI for everyone, and they're quite accessible, and I would encourage anyone interested to go for them. Secondly, I think we should also think about the way we think about the way we design AI systems and the way we work alongside them. I think to Chuan's comment on business goals. Business goals, sometimes we use it as a shorthand for like more profit. But really, I think in terms of the goals we want our AI systems to work for us for, there are many things we can optimize for. We can optimize for a better society, maybe addressing some of the broader world issues today. And so I think AI is like a very at the moment it's still a very powerful tool, but it still needs us to come in with the ethical layer to point it in the right direction. And so having thought in that topic is also very useful.
So as we come to the end of the session, I'd really like each of you to share with us one key opportunity going into 2021. Just one quick line. Perhaps David, you can start us off.
I would say let's not be afraid of the tough questions here. AI is raising tough questions about humans, let alone AI. First about humans. Let's not be afraid. We have help. We have ethicists. We have a lot of smart people, and we have a lot of goodwill. We can get through this. Let's not run away from the tough questions. They're right here. Let's deal with it. This generation, young people out there, that's you.
Juan, what are your thoughts? What's your one opportunity going into 2021 for AI and ethics?
Lots of opportunity for everyone, but provided you are willing to put in the hard work, relearn, reskill yourself, how to work alongside these kind of technology. And yeah, just get educated, keep yourself updated, and relearn.
And Amrit Anshu?
I would resonate what David said, embrace and change.
Jason?
I think I'll go with collaboration because I think the heart of ethics is that we have different values and we should invest in understanding each other so we can have these conversations in a productive way.
And Olivia?
Ethics is a stimulator for innovation, not a blocker. If you embrace ethical application, then really you're going to come out with far better long-term, robust solutions.
And last but not least, Professor Alessandro?
I think in the last 5 to 10 years, there has been a lot of hype about artificial intelligence. Now we are finally out of this period, and in the future, there are going to be more realistic expectations about. And I think in particular for young people that start a career in the domain, it's really a very good opportunity to do something that is really fruitful, effective, and can really make a positive change in the world.
This is Money FM 89.3, Singapore's most influential radio station. You've been listening to a forum discussion as part of the AIBotics Go Digital series on ethical and responsible AI. And we've been discussing key considerations to creating an ethical and responsible culture for building intelligent solutions. Lots of food for thought from this forum. Very interesting conversations. We've been joined by Professor Alessandro Vincerelli, Professor of Computational Social Intelligence at Glasgow University, Mr. Jason Tamarawijaya, co-founder at Loretta, Mr. Teng Chuan Hyung, and he's the managing director at Interactive, Miss Olivia Gamblin, co-founder at Ethical Intelligence, Mr. Amrit Anshu Roy, COO of Greenfield Advisory, and Dr. David Bodoff, senior lecturer at University of Haifa and head of research at Core AI Consulting. Thank you to all of our speakers for this wonderful discussion.
I'd like to call in Oliver for some parting words, closing thoughts. Oliver?
Yes, thanks, Elle, and thanks to the panel of speakers. I really appreciate your time, and in fact, lots of extremely interesting discussion. I was going through some of the questions that was raised by the audience, and some even private messaged me around why and how are the different people talking about ethics, and why are we not giving enough attention to this particular topic. In fact, slowly and surely, I believe there will be sufficient attention given to this topic. Given that AI is fast emerging and being part of our life, our daily lives, it is very critical and probably essential for many of us to start thinking about what AI can do and how we can coexist with AI. And in particular, if this AI algorithm is put inside robots, AI and robotics. Now, what is key for us to ask ourselves is, will you and AI be the future? Will we, the people, the human beings, and machines coexist together and be the future of what's to come? Whether it is 2021, whether it's 2025, and perhaps what do we think life and AI will be like in the year 2030? In 10 years' time, how much would that change our life? And what does it mean for our next generation as this new entrance into the industry come to play about? Will they be ready and be resilient and ready to adapt the change that comes along? 2020 has been a very interesting year when COVID-19 hit us and many of us were caught unprepared. We hesitated, we didn't know how to move, but there were a number of very creative and effective groups of people who turned around and pivoted in the right direction to come out winners with whatever impact that they have. So I guess the gist of this discussion is to set at least the stage for us to start thinking, well, technology and automation does replace some jobs, but it is more important that we can create our new jobs. If you look at history over the different industrial revolutions, mankind has always been able to come out as winners and eventually become masters of technology. So that is really the strong message that we want to share with everyone. And I hope this discussion has been interesting. As Elle and the moderator has mentioned, our next webinar will be held on the 15th of October. And the theme and focus of that discussion will be around the digital workforce. How can man and machine work together? Now having built the trust and at least the belief in the trust that is to come, the coexistence, the cohabitation of man and machine will be a very interesting and important discussion.